The popular history of the Second World War here in the United States tends to emphasize how we came together as a nation to counter Japanese and German aggression. But of course, it was never all that simple. With differing ideologies and internal divisions, the war on the home front was not without controversy, nor without opposition, and the needs of a nation at war conflicted with American ideals. And nowhere was that conflict more obvious than in 1944, when the nation braced for the largest sedition trial in United States history. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The American government struggled to navigate free speech and government criticism almost from the very beginning, especially in times of war. In 1798, John Adams championed the Alien and Sedition Acts in response to a dispute with France, in an attempt to prevent politically subversive speech and actions against the U.S. government. The country faced those issues in basically every major war. In 1861, the federal Congress passed the Seditious Conspiracy Statute, which makes it illegal for two or more people to commit acts of violence or forceful opposition against the U.S. government, either with intent to overthrow or prevent execution of a federal law. The inclusion of forceful means that speech alone is not criminalized, but any steps to further action is. The country again struggled with the fear of foreign agents during World War I, and a series of laws were passed to address concerns with espionage, anti-war activism, anarchism, and Bolshevism, in the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which were used to suppress criticism and imprison figures like socialist Eugene V. Debs. During the 1930s, fears of extremist and anti-American movements continued to grow. President Roosevelt ordered the FBI to investigate groups sympathetic to Nazism and communism, marking the beginning of surveillance on subversive elements in 1936. In 1938, the House of Representatives formed the House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate disloyalty and rebel activities of American citizens, especially ones with suspected communist ties. That same year, Congress passed the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which requires persons representing foreign interests to register with the Department of Justice. The growing certainty that the United States would enter World War II increased anxieties. The government was especially concerned with the concept of a fifth column, a secret group of sympathizers who could undermine the country with subversive activities and sabotage. Newspapers in the United States even blamed fifth column efforts for the shockingly rapid fall of France in 1940. Time magazine called anxiety over a fifth column a national phenomenon. These fears culminated in the Smith Act, or Alien Registration Act, signed into law the day France signed the armistice with Germany. While the act was aimed at aliens and sedition, it was also an anti-labor bill, which specifically targeted Australian-born union leader Harry Bridges, though ironically the bill failed to get him deported. The New York Times said that the act was merely one of many laws hastily passed in the first spasm of fear engendered by the success of fifth columns in less fortunate countries. It argued that though it was distasteful, the administration supported the legislation as it or similar laws were inevitable. The Smith Act was broad, making it a crime for anyone who, with intent to cause the overthrow or destruction of any such government, prints, publishes, edits, issues, circulates, sells, distributes, or publicly displays any written or printed matter advocating, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government in the United States by force or violence, and attempts to organize any society, group, or assembly of persons who teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow or destruction of the U.S. government. It allowed the deportation of any foreigners who at the time of entering the United States or at any time thereafter was affiliated with such a group. It also required all foreigners applying for a visa to register and be fingerprinted, and required all aliens over the age of 14 already living in the country to register and be fingerprinted in 30 days. Over 4.7 million people had registered by January 1941. In June of 1941, still more than 5 months from America's entry into the war, the law was used to raid the Minnesota offices of the Socialist Workers' Party in an effort to curb labor problems in the defense industry. The SWP had advocated continued agitation even as war came nearer. 29 people were indicted for allegedly planning to overthrow the U.S. government. As evidence, the prosecution pointed to a collection of pistols and rifles and the group's revolutionary rhetoric. The judge ordered 5 acquitted on lack of evidence, but 18 defendants were found guilty of violating the Smith Act for distributing material advocating the overthrow of the government. They were sentenced to between 12 and 16 months' prison. The law was used against George W. Christians, founder of the Crusader White Shirts. Christians was an erratic man of many public opinions who sought a revolution for economic liberty in the U.S. He both founded the American Fascists and claimed that he was so red that he made the Soviets look yellow. He even had a meeting with President-elect Roosevelt in 1932. The Jewish Daily Bulletin reported that he was subsequently questioned by federal agents who thought he might be insane. At trial, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison under the Smith Act. The act was used elsewhere as well. A group of 16 members of the quasi-religious Mankind United cult were charged under the act. Roosevelt pressed his Attorney General, Francis Biddle, to prosecute Nazi and fascist sympathizers as part of what had been termed the Brown Scare, similar to the later and more well-known Red Scare. It was a period of government suppression of fascism and Nazism. Prior to and during the war, there were a number of groups that either sympathized with Nazi Germany, especially in the Nazis' racial views, as well as isolationists and anti-war groups that advocated against American involvement in the war, or at least against Germany. They were not without their followers. The America First Committee, which counted among its members notorious anti-Semite Henry Ford and Roosevelt critic Charles Lindbergh, along with prominent senators, launched in September 1940 and had 800,000 members at its peak. While the committee was officially only an isolationist and anti-war group, it gained a reputation for anti-Semitism and Nazi sympathy. The German-American Bund, a Nazi organization established in 1936, held a rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939 that had over 20,000 attendees. The Bund was implicated in numerous plots in agitating to overthrow the U.S. government. These groups and other individuals sympathetic to Nazism were seen as a threat by Roosevelt's government, as a possible fifth column acting against American interests. It was not a silly fear. In 1940, a coup plot by fascist agitator George Deathridge to overthrow the government after the 1940 elections was uncovered. The Third Reich had been actively pushing pro-German propaganda in the United States since their rise to power, and not always through official sources. In 1941, George Viereck, a German poet and journalist, was caught orchestrating a brazen propaganda scheme. Viereck wrote pro-German tracts and received others directly from Berlin, and then worked with isolationist senators, especially New York Representative Hamilton Fish III, had those tracts inserted into the official congressional record. The plot then involved using congressional franking privileges, a perk given to congresspeople that allows them to send materials to their constituents without paying postage, to distribute the propaganda widely to Americans. The whole plot was uncovered through work by men like reporter Dillard Stokes, and while Fish himself escaped blame, one of his secretaries was convicted, and Viereck was eventually sentenced to 4 years for failing to register as a foreign agent. Fish's secretary, George Hill, once convicted, went turncoat and claimed everything he did was with the direct knowledge of Representative Fish. The case brought to light the significant and active efforts by groups like the America First Committee to drive support for Nazi Germany and undermine political opposition to fascism in general. The lawyer who tried the Viereck case in 1940 was William Power Maloney, a prosecutor for the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Maloney had a flair for getting into headlines, as the New York Times put it. Maloney was chosen as a special prosecutor to investigate seditious activity in the United States in 1942, a different time now that war with Germany was a reality. Maloney also successfully prosecuted numerous America First Committee-related people. The head of an Ohio chapter of the committee was convicted of being a paid Nazi agent, as was famous pilot and America First speaker Laura Hufftaling Ingalls. In March 1942, George Christians was the first to be indicted under the Smith Act after the beginning of the war. Rudolph Fall was just behind for attempting to influence the army and make seditious and disloyal statements. Christians was convicted and sentenced to 5 years. Others were charged under the 1917 Espionage Act. 3 members of the Friends of Progress were charged after holding mock trials of the president. Those charges were dropped, as Biddle said the trials were legitimate criticism. William Dudley Pelley, an anti-Semitic publisher, was sentenced to 15 years under the 1917 law in 1942. The 1917 Act was again used to halt the mailing of priest Charles Coughlin's anti-Semitic magazine Social Justice, as Biddle charged it repeated the lines of enemy propaganda warfare being waged against this country from abroad. Coughlin, under threat of sedition charges, was told by the archdiocese to cease the magazine's publication. Meanwhile, Maloney continued to make headlines for his activities and rooting out enemy sympathizers. He was earning himself significant backlash. Despite convictions, isolationist members of Congress like Hamilton Fish, Representative Claire Hoffman, and Senators Burton Wheeler and Gerald Nye all attacked Maloney and his methods. During the spring of 1942, Maloney made a show of calling congressmen in front of the grand jury. The attacks got especially vicious in July 1942 when Maloney charged 28 people with sedition under the Smith Act. None of the 28 were politicians, but many of them had shared ties to groups like the America First Committee. The congressmen were furious and argued that they were being targeted by a biased prosecutor for their isolationist positions for political reasons. Maloney, according to a letter from within the administration, had been tipping off news agencies, especially the Washington Post, about confidential information, such as grand jury testimony and possible indictments. Rumors swirled that he was building a case against people like Nye and Fish, although the Department of Justice knew we had no case against them. The 28 charged defendants were all forced to be charged in a single trial in D.C., and they were brought to the district from locations all over the country. The defendants were a who's who of anti-Semites and Nazi sympathizers, including Viereck, charged again, as well as Lawrence Dennis, an American diplomat who argued that the U.S. should embrace fascism, Elizabeth Dilling, an anti-Semite and anti-communist activist and Roosevelt critic, America First activist and suspected Nazi agent Robert Edward Edmondson, Gerald Burton Winrod, known as the Jayhawk Nazi, William Griffin, publisher of the New York Inquirer, leaders of the German-American Bund, William Dudley Pelley, founder of the American fascist organization the Silver Legion, once quoted saying he saw himself as the American Hitler, and Joe McWilliams, organizer of the Christian Mobilizers. It also included men like George Deatherage and Herman Schwinn, West Coast American Bund leader, implicated in a variety of plots in the 30s to try and overthrow the U.S. government with the help of the Bund and Laura Ingalls' husband, Charles. Several of them were already in jail for other convictions. The trial itself was much covered, but the government struggled from the outset to present a case. In an attempt to straighten out the charges, the indictments were amended and changed, and new indictments were granted in January of 1943 for all 28 of the original defendants, plus another 5. Meanwhile, the isolationist group in Congress targeted all their firepower at the investigation. Senator Robert Taft wrote to one of the charges that Maloney should be disbarred for the investigation. Representative Hoffman said those charged were poor, persecuted Christians. Senator Nye declared, "These people are no more guilty than I am." One of the leaders of the opposition was Montana Senator Burton Wheeler, a leader in the America First Committee. The campaign against Maloney was ultimately successful. He was promoted and taken off the case. While the campaign against him was intense, a memo from James Rowe, assistant to the Attorney General, to Biddle shows that he was also losing the faith of those within the administration. Rowe argued that Maloney's methods were never properly supervised and that Maloney was revealing testimony from the grand jury to the press, an act that was contempt of court. His behavior also threatened the case. When the Supreme Court threw out the Viereck conviction in August of 1943, they included a note that criticized Maloney's actions specifically. Wheeler was threatening to start an investigation and saying he could prove Maloney had been leaking grand jury secrets. Maloney, Rowe adds, was anxious to get out as well. He was afraid of Wheeler, as he had the goods on him. In his place, they put O. John Rogie. Rogie had been working with the Justice Department for most of the previous decade and made his name dismantling the corrupt machine that assassinated Louisiana Governor Huey Long. Rogie started by reviewing the entire case, calling his own grand jury and carefully planning his strategy. He was quiet throughout 1943, but in January 1944 he burst back into view with new indictments, focusing on the various members' attempts to push propaganda and radicalize members of the military. In his indictment, he alleged that the 30 accused unlawfully, willfully, feloniously, and knowingly conspired with officials of the government of the German Reich and leaders of the Nazi Party. Rogie had his evidence, over 4,000 exhibits of them. Many of the defendants, like Deatherage, had gone and met directly with Nazi leadership. There were letters asking for advice, instructions, and funding from the German government. Laura Ingalls, though not charged in the trial, had offered to German diplomats that she go abroad to support the movement. They had told her instead to work with America First. On April 17, 1944, the trial finally opened in D.C. with Judge Edward Eicher presiding, nearly 2 years after the initial indictments. The first delay came when one of the defendants, Edward James Smythe, had disappeared. They caught him 40 miles from the Canadian border, but he swore he had simply gotten the date mixed up. From the outset, the defense resorted to every legal trick at their command to forestall the proceedings and suppress the painstakingly gathered evidence, as the Washington Post described it. They accused the judge of bias, with one lawyer delaying the case when his accusations led to a charge of contempt of court. They attempted to subpoena Rogie himself, accused him of bribing witnesses, and tried to get the court reporter thrown out because she worked for a company with a Jewish executive. The defendants made a show of giving Nazi salutes on the steps of the courthouse, skipping court appearances, and generally making a nuisance of themselves in the press. They made outrageous plans to call people like Churchill, Roosevelt, and Biddle as witnesses, or to depose Hitler. At one point, the New York Times reported the judge was driven out of the courtroom by a violent, uproarious argument amongst the defendants and their lawyers. The court transcript is full of the judge gaveling furiously for order. Defendants shouted at Rogie to sit down when he made an objection. The defense lawyers grilled every juror on any possible connection or sympathy towards Jewish people. One of the defense lawyers said in court that the trial was a Jewish conspiracy. It took 5 weeks to finally choose a jury. Before opening statements were read, one of the defendants died of natural causes. Rogie couldn't even get his opening statement out without defense lawyers peppering the courtroom with motions and defendants hissing at him. At one point, the defense made objection after objection for a full half hour. The Washington Post described bedlam breaking loose in the courtroom. Defense lawyers in every corner of the courtroom shouting their objections, the din becoming so intense that you could not hear even their own voices. The Chicago Tribune reported that the courtroom approached the proportions of a riot. Defendants shouted, "That's a damn lie," and quipped, "I'm a Republican, not a Nazi." Rogie couldn't even get out his accusations that the defendants intended to impose on us a one-party system, to abolish freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom from arrest without cause, and all the other civil liberties guaranteed to us by the Constitution. He went on. The defendants themselves talked in terms of bloodbaths, of blood flowing in the streets, or hanging people from lampposts, or pogroms. One of the defendants stated that our pogroms in this country would make Hitler's look like a Sunday school picnic. All of it was overshadowed by antics. One of the two women showed up in court in her nightgown, claiming her clothes were stolen. 7 months in, the defendants began as a group to stuff envelopes that were congressionally franked by North Dakota Senator Wild Bill Lang. Lang had just given a 2-hour speech in the Senate that called the defendants political prisoners. That was just one in a series of congressional attempts to disrupt the proceedings. Lang actually showed up in the courtroom, embracing defendants. The other North Dakota Senator, Gerald Nye, had weekly meetings with the defense attorneys. Senator Wheeler called the case one of the most disgraceful proceedings in American judicial history. Ham Fish tried to change the 1940 law to remove the basis for the charges. One of the defense lawyers was dismissed by the judge, while others wore ribbons declaring themselves members of the Eicher Contempt Club for the numerous fines levied on them. Eicher ruled on more than nearly 500 defense motions for a mistrial and over 72,000 objections. The court transcript was 3 million words long. And then on November 29, 1944, Judge Eicher died in his sleep. His death meant a mistrial, and the whole case would need to be retried. And by then the war was entering its final stages, and the whole affair had been, with little exaggeration, an unmitigated disaster. The Justice Department chose to drop the case. It was an unceremonious end to a case that charged a remarkable cadre of Nazi sympathizers and anti-Semites of working with an enemy power in an attempt to undermine the war effort. Many of the defendants had documented connections to Nazi figures, and some had led plots to try to overthrow the U.S. government. Many of them were already in jail and would remain there for their crimes. One of the defendants, Lawrence Dennis, wrote a book that skewered the whole affair, titled A Trial on Trial. It was he who, tongue-in-cheek, dubbed the trial the Great Sedition Trial of 1944. Rogie went to Europe in the aftermath, interviewing Nazi leaders and investigating the connections between politicians like Wheeler, Fish, and Nye with the Nazi Party. The report was considered such a bombshell that Attorney General Thomas C. Clark, a friend of implicated Senator Wheeler, buried it and had Rogie dismissed from the Department of Justice. Rogie would continue to speak about the dangers of fascism in the years that followed. In 1946, he said that the removal of Hitler and Mussolini and a few of their collaborators does not mean that fascism is dead. As a historian, I would caution against jumping to comparisons with modern politics. These were different times and different people. The Great Sedition Trial uncovered real connections between people in the United States and the Nazi Reich that we were fighting, calling into question the popular idea that we were of a single mind during the war. It also called into question exactly how far the nation will go in its commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of ideas, especially in extraordinary times. The at best mixed results of the trial left open the question of the legitimacy of the process, but at the same time, the very real connections to the Nazi regime that were uncovered shouldn't be ignored. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.